Welcome everyone to the afternoon session. I have erosion on my property, now what? I'm Madeline Roberts and I'll be the moderator for this session. Before we get started, I want to remind you that this presentation is being recorded and to type any of your questions that you have into the chat box at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to wait to the end to ask our presenters some questions and we'll try to answer as many as we can. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel today, which includes Dave Ferris, Dan Harrington, and Jason Kieseth. Dave Ferris is the County Conservationist for Burnett County. He received his degree in agriculture and resource management from UW River Falls. Dave has been part of the Land and Water Conservation Department for over 35 years. He works with a variety of landowners, from agricultural producers to lakeshore owners. He has a lot of experience working with a variety of good, bad, and/or ugly shorelines and runoff. Dave administers Burnett County's popular Shoreline Incentive Program, or SIP, as well as being a member of the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Healthy Lakes Team. Dan Harrington has been a water management specialist with the Wisconsin DNR for 21 years, protecting lakes, streams, and wetlands from harm due to improper physical alterations in 11 counties in northern Wisconsin, including the entire shoreline of Lake Superior and associated islands. He evaluates habitat, water quality and quantity, and water use to make decisions on whether to permit waterway or wetland alterations, as well as providing technical assistance to local government officials. Jason Kieseth graduated from the University of Wisconsin River Falls with a double major in field biology and business administration. He has been the Polk County Zoning Administrator for the last 7 years. So we're going to have a couple of presentations, and then I'm going to kick off the Q&A session with asking Dan Harrington some questions about his role with DNR permitting. So with that, I will turn it over to Dave Ferris to start.
Okay, thanks, Madeline. And we'll get started here a little bit. And I did want to mention a little bit as we are getting going that the winter greenhouse also in winter also has native plants, and I believe there's one in Cableland that might be associated with them. And of course, somebody mentioned Dragonfly Gardens and also Prairie Restorations, which is just right across the river into Minnesota, but that is Boreal Natives is part of Prairie Restoration. So they kind of fit the whole bill all the way from woody vegetation all the way to warm season forbs and stuff like that. So anyway, as far as erosion goes, and I will tell you is you're going to see a few repeat slides because we all made ours independently, and I've seen the same one about twice already, and I know it's going to show up for you guys at least 2 more times. So would bear with us on that. And the first thing I want to talk about, and by the way, I also don't have a camera on my phone, on my computer, so you're stuck staring at the screen without me, which is probably good. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, to start out with, is the difference between seepage and drainage lakes and the erosion potential and nutrient value, what happens on that. That was touched in a couple other sessions earlier, and that when you have a drainage lake, whatever you do as riparian property owners around the lake goes into the lake, but because there's water in and water out, it goes in, it has a retention time of just a shorter period and then moves on out. As was alluded to earlier, on seepage lakes, it's groundwater movement and it's much, much longer of a retention time. And so what you riparian landowners put into the lake stays there for a very, very long time. So what you do to the lake is what you make it. And as we were discussing in the whole climate variability change type thing that was the keynote presentation, is riparian landowners can have more of an effect on water quality and such like that than climate change, because we as humans accelerate the changes even more than climate change because we're pushing more nutrients, more volume of runoff is just a large, so we can easily accelerate the change more than climate change, which is very interesting. Next slide, please. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to go into 2 different types of erosion. First, I'm going to talk about the upland erosion, which is you're seeing here. These are 3 different styles of erosion, and I'll bet you nobody can guess what the person on the right was. Well, he's a concrete contractor, so that's why his driveway is concrete and bigger than his cabin by far. But it creates a large amount of volume of water that comes off. And what happens with volumes of water is the each gallon of water that comes off the property is more or less about the same in the quantities of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. However, what happens is the more hard surfaces you have, the more gallons of water that you put off. So that's where you get that excessive nutrients and things like that because you're putting a whole volume of water in the water column, and it's as the algae is, be fruitful and multiply. Next slide. There's one that was part of a new construction, and you have to think about when you do some building, or I should say some additions in this case, is it wasn't specified that the contractor did any type of soil stabilization, and they did what they were supposed to. They left, and here's what we get. And this completely accelerates and has a real issue, and it needs to be stabilized quite radically because it's pumping a lot of stuff to the lake. Next slide, please. And these are a couple of different examples of what you can do with erosion control, and it really can cause a huge, huge problem. There's some major gullies, and it had some major costs to fix those up. Next slide. This is just a plain old simple runoff on a driveway, and it's a well-established cabin, been there for many years, but there is issues and there is volumes of water coming from above that really should be intercepted and moved off into a place where the vegetation can, use up the nutrients and the water can infiltrate. And I will also mention it, I don't have a slide of it, but what happens is when you have an excessive amount of runoff or you do a little extra fertilization or you have bare soil, all those different things, you can actually create a mini algae bloom in front of your property. My guys have been out on the lake. It's amazing. They'll see it and they'll be coming along and the water column will be clear next to shore. And then all of a sudden you hit algae. Well, what's there? Oh, that was a property line. Well, then there's algae for 100 feet. New property line, the algae stops. So it's very, very important of what you do and think about what you can do above your cabin and above the lake for stabilizing that for water quality. Next slide, please. This was a dandy. This one, the guy thought he was doing the right thing. He put an addition on his house. He had a ton of hard surfaces, and he thought, oh, geez, I'm going to put it all together in one collection point and then just run it down to the lake. Well, that was the result when you put too much volume in together. It was not a pretty sight, and he spent thousands of dollars fixing it up because he didn't think about what he was doing ahead of time. And as you're adding hard surfaces, you really want to be cognizant of that increased runoff. And by the way, I will mention at this point is Burnett County, along with Bayfield County and a few others, have actually did a book a bunch of years ago called Controlling Runoff and Erosion from Your Property, and that should be on the Burnett County's website. And we also did one about buffer restoration. It's on there as well. Next slide, please. Yes, yep, next one. And here's just a few solutions that you think about is what you can do here. The one on the upper left is just a diversion, a blacktop diversion that goes into an infiltration basin that's down there, quite decorative, and it's a little bit of a rain garden and diversion as well. Correct, thank you. The one on the right is basically stabilization. That is upper right, yes, thank you, is basically an infiltration basin, but it's also taking care of the roof water as well. And of course, the one on the bottom left is a brand new installed rain garden. And the one on the right is an infiltration basin. And that is not a bear, that is just a dog. So, but it works real well. We do a lot of them. In fact, we take infiltration basins, we can bury them so you don't even know they're there. Next slide, please. And this is just a rain garden that we captured all of the water from the cabin going down towards the lake. And because they had a gully that was starting just below this, we basically just stopped all the water there. And this, and by the way, this is only the year of installation. So it's not really very pretty yet, but believe me, this was absolutely beautiful after it got through. So next slide. This is the other type of erosion that we look at, and what's been discussed extensively, and what causes most of the problems when you get high water. In fact, in Burnett County, we have mostly seepage lakes, so this is a large area of the erosion or problem that we deal with. Is when seepage lakes come up, they have a tendency to rise and fall quite dramatically, and this is what we get when they come up. And this is really the issue that we're going to try and look at. And by the way, the next few slides, I spent hours and hours drawing on these, so we will talk about that and we can go from there. Next slide, please. Yes, it's a highly technical slide. This is a lake. Surprise, surprise. Next slide. Okay, well, I've done a lot of flying for work and things like that. And what I saw, and it was always bothering me, of what in the world did it look like? I saw all of this indentations. I call them the frowny face of lakes. And what it is it's the erosion that's caused by property owners that are utilizing the lakeshore maybe the way they want, but what it does is it creates indentations. And why does it make a frowny face like that? What in the world is, why does it make those half moons? Next slide, please. Okay, well, guess what, guys? Those indentations are the center of lots. And what I've realized after I went and ground truth while I was confused there is that everywhere the native vegetation is intact, which everybody usually leaves it by the property line because they're going to recreate in the middle of their lot, of course, is where they leave that native vegetation that holds the soil and the shoreline in place, where in the middle of the property where you take out all the native veg and you mow it, you do this, you do that, is you have a major indentation. That's significant from a number of aspects, notwithstanding the only one that it may create a non-conforming structure of your dwelling. So that shifts you into a different category of zoning and a whole bunch of different things that you may have to do because of this. And it's just plain a loss of your property, and it's not good for the lake. Every pound of soil is going in there is putting some nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. So what we're going to do is just look at, we really want to think about stabilizing that area. So the minimal amount of things that you can do along a shoreline, clearing both in the water column and on the shoreline, is by far very, very, very beneficial to your property. Next slide, please. And this is just a basic couple of things of, what do you have here? Is it a steep bank? Is it a shallow bank? This is what we see most of the time. And when you look on the bottom there, right there in that little toe, that's what you want to stabilize, because what happens is that the waves chew out underneath there, and then that edge of that bank is going to drop off. Well, then that soil goes out into the lake, then it starts that indentation again, and then it keeps doing the same thing over and over and over. So the good part about it is when you have a small erosion problem like that, especially on the sheepage lakes where the water is just coming up, it doesn't take a lot of work other than the cost of the rock to do it. And unfortunately, in many cases, rock is about the only thing that truly can be done with that. So next slide, please. And this is just basic rock, and it's exactly what we've been seeing before and what you saw in Stacy's presentation and things like that. Just basically fill in the rock, and it doesn't show it as good as I'd hope here, but put filter cloth behind and get that indentation full of rock, and that's going to really stabilize your shore, and it's going to hold everything in place. And with native plants above it, and ideally, if you can either leave it alone or put some native plants, as we discussed earlier, within the rocks of the rock itself, riprap, I should say, excuse me, is that makes it a much more, I call it an environmentally benign thing, because it allows creatures to basically kind of move up and down. They can't move through like they usually would, but at least they can get over it if there's some, leaves and stuff in there, so it's fairly smooth. So that's kind of what we're looking at there. And next slide, please. And this is just a DNR drawing. Dan Harrington will talk more about this on the same type of thing. But this is actually the drawing of a sample drawing of what you would do to check and see if you need a permit. If you do need a permit, which, not to steal some of Dan's thunder, but it has to be done to standards, although the permit process is fairly liberal right now. But that's really important to do the native veg above. That more, just as much, if not more critical than the rock. Rock is expensive. You want to use as little bit as possible, and native vegetation is much cheaper and it holds things in place just as well. So I would encourage, if you have erosion, to just do a small toe. Next slide. And of course, this is the one you see earlier, and you're going to see it later, is what's the difference? The one on the far left is your lawn grass, like Kentucky blue. Yep, and that's all that is for a root system, and all the rest of those are the various natives, and that's why the natives are so good at holding everything in place, because they have this incredible mix of root systems. And by the way, this is only the prairie plants. This doesn't even include shrubs and trees and stuff like that. So it's pretty impressive of what they can do as far as holding soil in place. Next. And last but not almost least, but we have a program here, which Madeline kind of alluded to earlier, is called our Shoreline Incentive Program. And what we do is we actually reward landowners in Burnett County for doing the right thing and following shoreline zoning. They sign a covenant that says, I agree to follow shoreline zoning, which basically means it's an intact 35-foot natural buffer, of course, excluding your viewing access area. And then what we do is we give a little cash up front, and then we do a $50 year property tax credit after that. So, and it's been very well received. We have, I think it's about 850 parcels in the program right now, and well over 50 miles, excuse me, of shoreline that's protected underneath this program. So, and that is at about one more slide, and I think that should be it for me. Yep, and I guess we're going to hold questions till the end. So Jason or Dan, whoever is next, can move on.
Thank you, Dave. Jason, I believe you're up next.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. And does he have my slides?
Pat, do you have his slides? Otherwise, I do, and I can go through them if you want, Jason.
If
Okay.
you have them handy, go ahead, Madeline.
Okay.
I'd have to toggle to the other one.
If you want, I can share a screen too.
You have the ability to, so go ahead.
Okay, sounds good.
There it comes. There we go.
All right, so Dave did a really good job on showing a lot of examples. I'm going to kind of go over some of the shoreline zoning standards and what we see a lot of too, and how the zoning laws in Polk County, you know, kind of affect the erosion potential that particular use of a property or development might cause. So a lot of our developments and that go back to the 10s through the 1930s, when a lot of our class 1 lakes were originally platted. At that time, you know, we had 16 by 20, you know, 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom cabin that was, you know, often built close to the water. We had a lot less development pressure at that time. Now, you know, that we're seeing a lot larger houses and still wanting to be closer to the water. So what does that do? It creates more runoff from the roofs, carrying that phosphorus and the nitrogen nutrients and that, and also could possibly be soil into the water. So also in that we have less scenic beauty just over time, and that as people are mowing their yards and stuff, we're losing vegetation around the lakes and that, and we lose tree cover and that because the trees are no longer in the woods and protected from some of the wood and the winds and storms and that they might be if they were in the woods. So it's been proven in that on many different bodies of water, and in Polk County, and that we have an example of that as well. Our lakes that are clearer and they have better water quality and uses of the water, the property values are higher. It's been proven that if the Secchi disc reading, which is the water clarity of the lake, goes down or drops by 3 feet, that's where you start to see the impact on property values. What can limit or contribute to the Secchi disc reading is some of that erosion because of that sediment. And that a lot of times on a new construction site, you might even see a sediment plume out in front of the property, like Dave was saying. You can also see an increase in that based on the amount of water coming off the roofs and the increase of the temperature in the lakes. And often in that, whether or not they use erosion control measures around the new site or the development, that's another big contributing factor. So you can see this one here, and that is got some silt fence up. It doesn't look like it was installed properly because the silt fence needs to be trenched in at the bottom. They haven't maintained it. The silt fence is falling over. And basically in that picture, and that there really is no erosion control that's helping. So it's very typical in that to see dirty water go through silt fence. And that's one of the complaints that we get a lot of the times that we follow up on, is if the silt fence is installed, they can still get dirty water running into the lake or into another property. But what we don't want is the actual sediment that it carries, which in this picture definitely has sediment going over the top of the silt fence and probably under it too. So in shoreline zoning, the DNR has an administrative code in that it's called NR 115. This was developed in that back in the late 60s as the minimum shoreline zoning standards. A county back then could be more restrictive on these 7 bullet points. In 2015, Act 55 came along and stated that a county can no longer be more restrictive on any of these. So if regulation proposed by a county does not fall underneath one of these 7 things, then the county can regulate it. Like, for example, side yard setbacks, maybe the color of the siding of a building, maybe, that where, the building is located, and that except for like a dwelling with the building setback. So if we look at these 7 things too, it's very linked into the erosion and the contamination that could happen to a lake. The smaller the lot sizes we have, the more potential we have for more development and less buffer area, and even in between the lots. So that could have an effect on the erosion. Setbacks and that, I got a picture in that, but definitely the closer you put that runoff source or that building to the water, is just going to limit the amount of space and various soils that are going to have the ability to absorb that runoff before it hits the water. So setback can be huge. There's been a lot of studies done that even the 75-foot setback that's required underneath NR 115 is generally not enough in that if you have mowed grass and stuff from stopping that water to get to the lake. Dave mentioned a slide about the type of vegetation that you have in place and how the root systems can take and affect that runoff, and also in that the amount of water that's taken up. And that, our grass right now, we're pretty dry down here. It's not taking up any water, and that because it's got a really short root system, whereas some of those deeper rooted plants and that they're going to be able to keep going and not die off. Filling and grading is something in that I think has relaxed a little bit over the years, and that because of kind of administration of it. The building inspector and that, or the UDC code. And when I say UDC, that means Uniform Dwelling Code Inspector, is the one that's in charge of administering the erosion control on a new dwelling site. And then for sewer systems, and that the sanitary code also has some erosion control standards in it. But other than that, you know, that we're seeing and that we're having to allow boathouses now, and that extra filling and grading activities that are being allowed on steeper slopes can definitely have some impact. The amount of impervious surface that's allowed on a property, that's just hardscape. I believe most counties count gravel driveways as hardscape as well, and that they pack down nice. That's why we like them for driveways, but consequently they shed most of the water off. That would be also roofs, patios. Most counties, I believe, do not count decks, and that if they do have the cracks between the boards, because it allows the water to go through. There are pervious methods in that for decks and for patios, and that can have some of those infiltration components and that associated with them. Height of it doesn't really have that much effect on erosion, but the farther that water's falling off of a roof, or if we're channelizing it into a valley on a roof, that can definitely create more erosion where that's coming down to the land surface. So, and non-conforming structures, that's just how close the house is to the property. And that line could be to the water. Maybe they got a dry run, and that how close it is to that can all affect the erosion. So this is kind of some changes in that have happened the last year. A shoreline zoning ordinance, as I stated, cannot be more restrictive than NR 115. Also, as part of Act 55 in 2015, a county can no longer require the establishment of a vegetative buffer on previously developed land. Now, when we say previously developed, that doesn't mean that it necessarily had to have a house or a cabin on it. When they're talking about vegetation in the buffer, that means previously cleared land. So in other words, if land has been cleared prior to the adoption of the shoreline ordinance in that particular county, that's previously developed, and it's allowed to continue that way on that unless the owner wants to reestablish it on their own. The only time in that a county could really require an expansion in existing vegetative buffers is if that's needed in order to do some kind of a development on the property, like let's say the gazebo rule or the open structure rule, or maybe if they had too much impervious and they wanted to add impervious to the property, then the county could use a buffer enlargement as a mitigation tool. And the county is no longer able to really regulate a lot of the non-conforming structures as it was in the past. In the past, and that a lot of counties required permits for maintenance and repair to those non-conforming structures. Now they're able to tear them down and rebuild them in the same footprint. And those are happening quite often. And a lot of people are now able to expand because there's a couple various expansion options, like vertical expansion and a 200 square foot lateral expansion if they're 35 feet back from the water. So, so there is some increase in square footage now allowed as well. Which is kind of going into my first bullet point there. Underneath NR 115, every property is allowed 15% impervious, and you can have 15 to 30% impervious as long as you mitigate whatever you're over 15%. So that's very common what we are doing on all of our permits, and that is calculating how much hardscape, you know, driveways, roofs, all that kind of stuff, and then we divide that by the total land area to get our percentage. And if somebody puts in an infiltration pit and that's capturing all the water coming off from that particular hardscape, that hardscape then is no longer able to be counted towards the 15% because it's considered treated. lot of times we're talking about erosion control, and that from agricultural fields, often drainage ditches or drainage ways. And unfortunately, in that our hands and on the zoning side are limited to be able to control them any differently than we would normal shoreline property. So when we talk about that vegetation down by the lake, these are for properties that would be not considered not previously developed. They are allowed a 35-foot wide viewing corridor for every 100 feet of shoreline that they have. This is within that buffer zone. So this is within the first 35 feet of the ordinary high water mark. The viewing corridor can be split up or it can be contiguous. So in other words, if you had 200-foot shoreline property, it would be possible in that underneath the law to clear 70 feet wide, and that in one chunk. So, or you could split it to 235s or whatever combination you would want. Again, I said in that we would allow, installation of a buffer as a mitigation option for the properties that are over 15% impervious, but it is not required. This is something that I believe in that some of our lake districts around here, particularly on Deer Lake, have been very successful on, letting their residents that live around the lake know how important a buffer is. And I know the Healthy Lakes program has even had some incentives in that for some financial help and that to get some of these plantings down by the water where they're going to help. So that's one of the biggest things I can say is, and that zoning used to be a good tool to try to get buffers in place, and that unfortunately they're not anymore. So we kind of have to fall back on trying to just educate people and letting them want to do it on their own. A lot of times in that we do some permitting for filling and grading activities that reduce the slope of the property. If we have some slopes that just don't grow any good vegetation, that can't seem to sustain maybe leaf cover or mulch without washing off, we do see and that sometimes in that where we'll allow them to drop that back to a 3-to-1 slope, and then either mulch or put washed rock on it, and that to use it as a filler that's fairly stable. So, and that can be done within the 75-foot setback area. So some important definitions on that have changed also within the last 5 to 6 years. Here is the shoreline setback area. That means basically the setback off the ordinary high water mark. The shoreline setback area is typically 75 feet, and typically everything has to be out of that shoreline setback area as far as structures go, except for the exempt ones that I have on the next slide. But basically a structure means any garage, shed, accessory building, sidewalk, stairway, walkways, patios, retaining walls, porches, and all these structures would require permits in most counties in order to build them. So, and this is just saying that they all are required to meet the 75-foot setback. There is one rule that exempts this. We have our exempt structures, but then we also have setback averaging, which is when we can average between 2 adjoining dwellings and that. So if you have a property in the middle and you have a lot on each side, you can take the average setback of your 2 neighbors' dwellings, and that would be your new conforming setback. So if one's at 40, one's at 60, the lot in the middle could build at 50 feet for their dwelling, and they would actually be considered conforming, not non-conforming. So here's a list of the exempt structures that can be within the 75-foot setback. A boathouse can be, and that the DNR has given us the guidance that a boathouse can have a little bit of a setback off the ordinary high water mark, but the setback required by the county, and that cannot be prohibitive of using that building as a boathouse. They have to be within the access and viewing corridor, which is at 35 feet for every 100 feet, and cannot contain plumbing or be used for human habitation or sleeping purposes. The open-sided or gazebo structures, and that can be done as long as the house is beyond 75 feet from the water, and the structure is at least 35 feet back from the water. So between the 35 and 75, they're limited to 200 square feet and have to be within that area. So another good opportunity for people to be able to enjoy their property, but this is a issue sometimes in that because we got hardscape at 35 feet back. Fishing rafts and TV broadcast receivers can also be placed within the setback area, and utilities would be exempt. Walkways and stairways, and that down to the water are allowed, but they have a maximum of 60 inches wide or 5 feet. Typically in that, there's no standards in that, at least in Polk County, that would require them to be wood or concrete. We do have some that have, grass pass or even some trap rock pass that are limited to 60 inches wide. But we have some concerns when we start putting the trap rock if we have steep slopes. So this is just kind of a picture of what a typical, lake property might be. You can see we got the 35-foot setback there in the darker gray. And then we've got our 75-foot setback, which is where our building and everything is supposed to be located beyond. Anything within that red circle for the setback area there, that is the shoreline setback area. Anything that's in that gray area, that's called the shoreline protection area or buffer area. So that's what we're looking at when we're looking at buffers. And you can see in the picture, they have the 35-foot viewing corridor, which can be grass right up to the water. Again, that's probably not the best for the erosion though. So as Dave was showing, and that you can see, and that you can take and have a lot of movement in shoreline with ice ridges and stuff, and that if you just have grass. So in this picture here, and that you can see nice place. It's got a completely mowed yard right up to the water. You can see we got a lot of wave action moving back and that eroding away that grass, undercutting the banks. And eventually they're going to keep on losing shoreline, and that's going to make their building maybe not the setback that it was originally. So they could even have a building that becomes non-conforming, and besides losing all that frontage into the lake. So a lot of times in that they can, have better habitat if they have some natural plants around. They can see more birds. So there's a lot of benefits in that to having other vegetation besides grass, and that between the lake and the house. And with like this picture, and that the cumulative impact you can imagine, and that if we are on a lake lot that has 100 feet wide and everybody does this, that can really change the natural scenic beauty of the lake. And a lot of people, when they come up to the lake, they like the Northwoods feel, they like the remoteness, they like the serenity of the lake, and they can definitely have a cumulative impact that can change that lake for potentially for years. This is basically the same slide that Dave showed. You can see, and that just the various routes. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but there's a lot of different options, I want to say, for native plants that can actually be very nice looking and also do a very good job at stabilizing the soil and providing that habitat and natural scenic beauty. So this is just kind of a chart. If we're looking at controlling erosion and runoff, you can see that'd be the second yellow bar down from the top. And 75 feet is, not really adequate for that. 100 feet would probably be better. Nutrient control as far as the phosphorus and nitrogen, 75 feet is about in the middle there. But as far as any sediment control, that really varies depending on what practices are in place, because if you did have all the proper erosion control, using erosion control matting and all the other methods, you can definitely take and be closer to the lake and not have the same impact. But if somebody has nothing and they're 400 feet away, they could still be impacting and providing a lot of sediment into the lake. So one of the things in that we end up working with the most, and that is infiltration, because a lot of our properties have been developed for a long period of time. Like I said, the little cabins are getting into homes, and even large homes. And so often we're exceeding the 15% threshold. And we actually have some infiltration pits, or what we call full detainment, which helps that in many ways in that, but basically it reduces the amount of runoff coming off the property, allows for soil to treat the water before it gets into the lake, reduces any erosion, because typically these infiltration systems are close to the source of the runoff. They can be very long-term because they can be subgrade. We don't have to worry about like leaf litter and other soil particles plugging them up like some of our pervious paver systems. They can require minimal maintenance, and they're pretty economical because a lot of times it's just rock and doing a little bit of digging or planting. So here's kind of the first picture in that you might see for an infiltration pit install. I wish I could have had a little bit better sand and that shown in the bottom here, but you can see that there is some rock and stuff. It doesn't do any good to put in an infiltration pit if we have heavy soil or if we have groundwater in the bottom of the pit. So we just want a good pit that's got nice soil that's going to allow that water to percolate out. And typically in that, for like septic systems, it requires 3 feet of good soil in order to fully treat that wastewater and that going down. So this would be the start of the pit, and you can make it basically any dimensions, but just be conscientious about where your groundwater level is, because you can change the actual dimensions and depth of the pit to accommodate your site. Then what they're doing in this picture is they lined the whole pit and that with filter fabric. And then they stubbed in their gutters coming into here. And that's so that the rain coming off the roof will go right into this. This is all subgrade. Most of them, we do have an overflow pipe that is put out closer to the top of the pit in case we have that unique storm event. All of our calculations are calculated based on a 25-year storm event in Polk County. And but this is all it is. This is clean rock. So the pore space in this rock, and that is going to be where the water is going to be able to hold up until it can infiltrate through. Or like I said, if we have that really large storm event, we can take and have some water leave. So basically in that, this is anywhere from 3/4 to 2 inch clean rock. And we like to see a filter on it to try to prevent and that any other foreign debris from getting into here. But this is probably not the best place to put it. It's probably better up closer to your gutters and that, or your downspouts where they're going into this. So these can be left completely open if they want to take and have that in their yard or their landscape plan. Dave had one that kind of showed like a dry run swale of rock. They can look very nice. Or they can actually cover this up with filter fabric and put a light layer of black dirt over it and seed it so that it can be all subgrade as well. So they're a good option, fairly economical, and they don't take up a lot of real estate. So that's what I have for infiltration pits. This is a picture of a new construction site. You can see the builder here, and this was right after a rain. The whole yard out here is saturated. They had to build the house way up, so they're changing the sloping and the water runoff of this property. They actually have no silt fence here. I'm actually standing on the edge of a wetland, and that when I took this picture, so it goes to show you how much water can come off, and that in a small rain and end up where you don't want it. So
Hey, Jason.
yes,
We are gonna need you to wrap up so we can just
okay,
ask Dan some questions and get to
sounds
some of
good.
our
I
participants'
got
questions as well.
okay, sounds good. I got like 2 more slides in that.
Sounds good. Yep.
Okay. This is one of those steep slopes, like I mentioned in that a boathouse and that is now allowed, and that through the DNR. So here's a slope that's probably 30 to 40 feet. We got 2 different track holes that are moving it up the slope just because of how steep it is. And it's something that is now allowed, so we have to address it appropriately. So, and we would suggest, that with the silt fence here, that which isn't installed in this yet, but we do have a lot of natural growth here. And then they would put erosion control blankets and that around that right away. So a lot of times removing the trees and brush in that during the summer is not always the best. Here's a site where they cleared their viewing corridor, burned the brush, and then they had a pretty good rain. You can see that we have a lot of movement of the ash from the fire and that down the slope, and this all went into the water, and now you have to try to take and stabilize this slope right now. So it's better off to probably do it in stages rather than all at once. So, and with that, here's a list of our staff and that in our office, and if you have any questions, you can always give us a call. So thank you.
Thank you, Jason. So like I said, as we start our Q&A, I'm just going to ask Dan a couple quick questions as far as how DNR gets involved. So
Sure.
Dan,
Actually, Madeline, would it be okay if I kind of shared my screen with everybody and kind of go through
sure.
permitting process?
Yeah.
Okay. And is there another presenter at 3:30 or is this the last?
Nope,
session?
this is the last one, but we would like to stay on time.
Okay, got it. I'll go through this quite quick. So when is a permit required for rock riprap on the shoreline? I guess anytime you put any structure on the bed of the lake below the ordinary high water mark, some type of approval is required by the state. And as you saw in Jason's slide, where it showed the ordinary high water mark, which is basically the bank or the change in vegetation from aquatic to terrestrial, is the defining line on who regulates what. Anything back beyond the ordinary high water mark is going to be regulated through the local municipality, whether that be a county, city, village, that their ordinance is going to come into play. From the ordinary high water mark waterward is that's where the state regulates any activities below or cantilevered actually over the ordinary high water mark as well. So for rock riprap permits, there's essentially 3 different
Dan, go ahead and share your screen. If you hit that green button at the bottom and share your screen, we'll be able to see what you want. Thank you. So on the bottom, there you go. On the bottom is a share screen option. You finding that? There it
yes.
Coming now for us. There we go. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Just want to make sure we're on the same page. Thank you.
Okay, so to obtain permits, we have 3 different processes. There's some lakes are exempt. And if you qualify for a general permit, and I'll touch on a general permit versus an individual permit, but I first want to talk a little bit about exemptions. So there are certain standards, and I will this is the exemption checklist. Okay, the main kicker here is that the rock cannot be placed in an ASNARI water, and that stands for an area of special natural resource interest. And the other big thing is that rock riprap cannot exceed 200 feet on any inland lake and 300 feet on the Great Lakes. And the exemption actually allows for rock larger than a permit. It allows for rock to be up to 48 inches, and it allows the rock to go out further than a permit normally would. So this is the big one. Is my water in Asnari water? So folks go to our surface water data viewer, and this is where we're at right now. And you click on a show layers tab, and I'm going to go through this quick. But this is the area that this is the tabs that you click, and then you zoom in, and I'll just go to a lake in Burnett County, Sand Lake. So any of the lakes that turn up orange are considered an Asnari water, and are not eligible for an exemption. So if you are eligible for an exemption, that form I had up on my screen does not need to be submitted anymore. It's just, if you meet the standards, you're eligible to put rock riprap. And unfortunately, you can see, a lot of these smaller lakes in Burnett County are not Asnari water and are eligible to place rock riprap. Normally these smaller lakes don't need it, but the law does allow for that under this exemption now. So the permitting process is all done online. Like I said, there's either a general permit needed or an individual permit. And this is our wetland and waterway permit page. And we'll just go through this briefly. It's got a number of different questions and answers on when do you need a permit. This is a link to the exemptions. One of the things that we don't allow riprap for is for a manicured lawn or a nice tidy line. And the way that is calculated is the applicant has to do an energy calculator along the shoreline. And I'm not going to go through this, but essentially what it is you print out the lake map and you draw a line from your residence across the lake to the farthest, to see essentially how far can the wind blow to generate the highest wave at the project site. And you type in all the numbers here, and then you'll either become it'll either say high, moderate, or low energy site. Well, a general permit is only allowed for a moderate or high energy site. A low energy site does not qualify for a general permit and would require an individual permit. The individual permit process is it's a $603 application fee. The adjoining properties are notified via certified mail. And there's also a legal notice that gets published in the paper for the public to comment on the process. And that is a 30-day window for somebody can call me, ask for additional information, or hold an informational hearing. I'm going through I guess I have a couple. This is a photo of something that just happened last fall. This individual thought he was exempt, and that rock riprap is actually, it's on the lake bed 15 feet, and we're working with the landowner in removing a lot of that rock. I guess I know I've only got about 5 minutes left, Madeline. Do you have other questions that folks have?
Yeah, actually, I think this is a good segue into a question we had in our last session where someone had rocks that were falling out of their shore. It's a naturally wooded shoreline, but because of the high water, it's undermining some root systems. The rocks are 4 to 10 inches in diameter that have now moved into the lake bottom. Can they move those rocks back towards their bank, or is that permitted?
Nah, that's actually not allowed. The naturally occurring rocks do provide spawning habitat, especially for walleyes. The department has spent, the lake associations too have spent considerable amount of money on constructing walleye spawning reefs by hauling in rock on the ice for walleye spawning beds. And you really want to use a bigger rock, 18 to 36 inches. And most importantly is that the filter fabric should be placed behind that rock as well, so that the waves don't take soil back with it as it penetrates the rock.
Okay, so it sounds like a situation where you might want to contact someone to do a site visit, is what I'm hearing.
Right.
Okay. One of the other questions we had was that this is a person on the North Shore where 3 out of 5 years they get a huge ice push that significantly modifies the shoreline. Many owners are reluctant to invest in shoreline erosion strategies because they would be destroyed nearly annually. Do you, Dan, I know you've got experience on the North Shore, or any of the other panelists want to comment on that?
The North Shore of Lake Superior?
Possibly.
It doesn't indicate what lake. Well, okay, so ice ridges, the historic ones that are old with large trees in them, we recommend folks leave them alone because they've been there a long time. They're established. They've got good root structure on them. Just leave them alone. The other ones where we get I think it was 2 winters ago, there were quite a few ice pushes, and it typically happens where the shoreline is devoid of vegetation, and it's usually where it's sandy soil. Now, if you do get an ice push, the department, we always tell the landowner to contact county zoning, because this is, activity going on in the county shoreline zoning area. But we do allow people to remove them as long as they don't push them back into the water. They can be pulled back. And again, as long as there's not a wetland behind them. But the caveat is, please contact county zoning to ensure that they don't require any permits as well. And I think some counties treat those differently. Some allow for a bobcat to come in. Others do not. They have to be hand removed. I don't know, Jason, do you?
Yeah, so we do permit them. They're quite common on some lakes, and it's typically the grassier sites and that we see, and that the most or the biggest ones being pushed up. The ones in that where they got the large trees established on them, and that we do work with the DNR on that, because those ones are probably outside of their viewing corridor, so they wouldn't be able to remove those as either. But within their viewing corridor, they'd be able to remove the ice ridge and that in Polk County here. But a lot of times it is those grassy sites that we see the issue, and it's just a landscaping permit. Polk County, we do allow them to pull them back, and we've got a couple contractors that actually have vibrating plows, that where they can kind of push them back down if they're not too bad. But the main problem here is that we're losing footage, and that, so we can be making our structures non-conforming.
Right. And one other thing I forgot to touch on is how long does the permitting process take? Statutorily, once we get a complete application, we have 30 days to review it. That's for a general permit. Now, an individual permit, that the timeline is a little longer, but the majority of the applications that we receive for Riprap are the general permits. And those are, it might not be me issuing those permits. These are usually farmed out to other DNR staff throughout the state.
Okay, one last question. Who would you contact for a site visit?
I, excuse me, I cover 11 counties, and I try to do as much as I can from the desktop right now. So I start with asking the landowner to submit some site photos, and if I can determine, what I need to from that, then I probably won't do a site visit. But if it's something really severe or something controversial it may be controversial, then that would be me.
Yeah. So of our panelists, who would be the best to be a first point of contact if you have an erosion problem?
It would depend. If you want like technical advice, any land and water conservation department would be more than happy to do that and say, yes, looks like rock riprap is here, might be a different option, or, some of the options that Stacy had earlier, it's hard to tell. But that would be the first start. And then after that, you can move on to the regulatory stuff with Dan.
Sounds good. Well, we are just a little bit past time. Thank you for staying on for some of our last questions. And thank you